Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're opening up a really remarkable historical text. It outlines what might be one of the most demanding codes of conduct you could imagine for spiritual adherence.
Yeah, we're going way beyond just, basic respect or good manners here.
Way beyond. We're looking at a profound structure of duty, of absolute awe, and this is the interesting part, required intellectual engagement.
That's right. For this deep dive, we're focused on some key excerpts from the writings of Qāḍī Numan, specifically his Kitāb al-Himma fi Ādāb Atbāʼ.
Which translates roughly to the code of conduct for the followers of Imam.
Exactly. And this work, it wasn't written to offer suggestions. It was written to define a complete spiritual and practical life, all governed by this one single powerful relationship.
And the mission for you, our listener, is to really get a grasp on the intensity of this requirement. We're trying to answer a core question. According to this code, what are the spiritual and intellectual responsibilities that come with holding these leaders, the Imams, in the absolute highest esteem?
And it's less about what the Imams are and more about the devotion required from the person following them.
Exactly.
And to really appreciate the mandate, we have to start with the framework Qāḍī Numan sets up right away. This duty, it isn't a standalone thing.
Okay.
The source material explains that this respect for the Imams is part of a devotion that God has, well, fundamentally linked together.
Yeah.
We're dealing with a really powerful theological idea here. Devotion to God, devotion to the Prophet, and devotion to the Imams are all deeply associated in this one mandatory duty.
Wow. So that initial connection, it changes everything.
It does.
It's not just about respecting a teacher or a leader. It's being framed as an extension of your basic duty to the divine. So let's unpack that. It's explicitly stated that holding the Imams in the highest esteem is a, quote, duty enjoined on us by God.
That emphasis is critical. It elevates this whole code of conduct from, say, a cultural norm or a tradition into a theological imperative, a must-do.
Yeah.
And that tripartite link is what gives the Imams their immense authority. In this view, by honoring the Imam, the follower is fulfilling a duty that's tied to the highest possible forms of devotion. You can't separate them.
So that raises a huge question about the standard then. If devotion to the Imam is tied to devotion to the Prophet, I mean, how high is the bar set for reverence? Does the text get specific?
Oh, it doesn't leave it vague at all. This is where the code demands the absolute maximum. It's explicitly stated that it is incumbent upon all followers to revere the Imam of their time to the same extent to which the Prophet was revered by the followers of his days.
Wow, to the same extent. That standardizes the devotion across time. It means the spiritual authority of the living Imam has to be treated with the exact same weight as the Prophet. That's an extraordinary claim.
It's a huge claim with enormous practical implications. Because if you accept that standard, it dictates very specific obligations. The followers is required to hold the Imam in reverence, to bow down to them with humility, and this is key to obey their commands and their prohibitions. The expectation is nothing less than total submission in your spiritual practice.
All driven by this divinely mandated reverence.
Exactly.
So if that's the level of spiritual submission required, we have to ask how that authority measures up against, regular human power, worldly power.
And that leads us right to the second pillar of this code, this profound contrast between spiritual dignity and worldly power.
This part is fascinating.
It's one of the most striking features of the text. Qāḍī Numan instructs followers to have a greater respect for the Imams than for worldly kings.
Greater than kings.
And not just that, they have to stand in much greater awe of them than they do for any dignitaries or princes or powerful figures in the world. It's a deliberate reordering of your priorities. Spiritual authority is placed unequivocally above any earthly rule.
But that challenges the fundamental way society works, doesn't it? I mean, usually power and wealth are what demand deference. If someone has more money, a bigger army, they typically command the most fear. So what is the motivation then for this greater awe of the Imam?
Well, the source material is very clear that the motivation has to be entirely different. It draws a sharp line between worldly men and true followers.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Worldly men respect kings because of their wealth, and they fear them because of their pomp and power. They're motivated by material things, greed, survival, physical threat.
So the spiritual follower has to be motivated by something intangible.
Precisely. The follower must revere their spiritual head because of the dignity of the imamat. and the awe they feel, that's supposed to be due to the dazzling light of divine wisdom that's radiating from their forehead.
Let's pause on that phrase for a second. The dazzling light of divine wisdom. That is such a vivid metaphor. It's not just saying the Imams are wise. It implies they are, conduits of some illuminated truth.
I think that's a perfect way to put it. This light represents their perfection of intellect, a flawless connection to divine truth. And the follower recognizes that light as the source of their authority. It makes all worldly power seem secondary.
So your respect and fear have to be prompted by, as the text says, no other motive than the desire to please God who elevated them in the first place.
Right. You're not respecting them to, say, get a tax break or gain some kind of political favor. You're doing it purely as an act of devotion.
And the consequences for failing to do this, for failing to maintain this very specific kind of respect, is incurring the wrath of God. The stakes couldn't be higher.
They're absolute. And to help the follower sort of contextualize this, the text offers an analogy. It says, to think of the Imams as kings in the realm of religion.
Oh, okay.
It gives them the highest possible status, a king, but immediately confines that kingdom to the sacred. It strips away all the worldly stuff, the material wealth, the political games.
But I have to ask, doesn't this level of awe just become psychologically exhausting? To constantly fear and respect a spiritual leader more than any powerful figure in the world seems to require an incredible amount of mental discipline.
That is the profound challenge, isn't it? It demands a permanent state of mind.
Yeah.
It suggests that if you're truly living this life, worldly concerns, even the threat of a king, should just naturally pale in comparison to the spiritual authority of the Imam.
Your ultimate fear becomes displeasing God.
By disrespecting the one he has illuminated, yes.
Okay, so the reverence is settled. It must be absolute. But this whole concept of the dazzling light implies there's also an intellectual part to this, right? It's moving beyond just passive submission.
Exactly. It's not enough to just be physically present or obedient. Your mind has to be active. And the text cites a specific tradition to make this point. To look at the Imam is a devotion, and to look at the Qur'an is a devotion.
That parallel is incredibly powerful. Looking at the person is like looking at the sacred text. But what kind of looking are we talking about here?
It's clarified immediately. The word looking doesn't mean some absent-minded glance.
Right.
The tradition demands thoughtful looking. If you just, observe the Imam without applying your mind to the significance of their presence, their conduct, that divine light, the source argues you gain no spiritual advantage from it.
Which connects the duty to revere the person of the Imam with the duty to actively engage with divine wisdom, just like you would with the Quran. The source even brings up that rhetorical question from the Quran.
Yes. Do they not ponder on the Quran? Are their minds locked up?
And it deploys that question here to show that if you're not getting it, the failure is in your mind, the follower's mind, not in the source of the wisdom itself.
That connection is vital. It establishes that devotion isn't blind faith. It has to be informed by deep mental application. The quality of your engagement is everything.
It reminds me of another tradition it cites about depth over volume.
Yes. Reading of one verse thoughtfully is better than reading the Quran thoughtlessly for the whole night.
So a single moment of focused, contemplative engagement is valued more highly than hours of just, going through the motions.
Yeah.
That feels like a very modern take on quality over quantity.
And they really drive this point home with a historical example, the Qādīs.
Right. For listeners who might not be familiar, they were an early Islamic group known for a very literal, sometimes extreme interpretation of the Quran.
Exactly. And the text uses them as a negative example, as a how not to do it. The tradition says the Qādīs read the Quran, but it does not go down into their hearts.
Why not?
Because they just mutter it. They don't apply their minds to it. They perform the external actions, but because their minds are locked up, because they lack that thoughtful pondering, the wisdom is just, it's wasted on them.
So that same rigorous standard, that intellectual duty, has to apply to listening to the Imams as well.
It does. Followers have to pay full attention to their words, be all ears when they talk, and then after they're finished, they have to take time to ponder over the matter. The processing of the information is a non-negotiable part of the practice.
And the reason for all this circles right back to the beginning. The follower has to remember that the words of the Imams are, quote, practically the words of the Prophet himself. You're getting divine wisdom unfiltered.
Right. The requirement for absorption is immense. But this whole system assumes perfection in the source, which brings us to, I think, the biggest paradox in the whole code.
What happens when that intense pondering just hits a wall?
Yes. How do you navigate complexity when your human mind simply cannot grasp the divine wisdom?
This is section 4. Maintaining faith even when your own comprehension fails. This feels like the ultimate test of the whole system.
It really is. It addresses the limits of human intellect versus the assumed perfection of the source. The follower has to start from a place of belief that every word from the Imams is full of wisdom, that every expression means a world of good.
The burden of proof is entirely on the receiver.
Entirely. And it introduces a very humbling idea here, that the ability to even understand these deep things is a gift of God. It's conferred on those he likes and, well, withheld from those he dislikes.
So if you're struggling to understand, it's not a critique of the teaching. It could be a sign that you just lack that divine gift.
Which puts the full responsibility back on the follower. And the code gives very explicit guidance for what to do when you find the words complicated or beyond your depth, or you dislike some part of it, or even find it meaningless.
And the core lesson is what?
The core lesson is severe, but it's consistent. The fault lies with the listener. You should immediately admit your own inefficiency.
That is a total surrender of intellectual autonomy. Instead of saying, this teaching is unclear, you have to say, my mind is insufficient. So if you reach that point, what's the protocol for doubt?
There are clear steps. First, you refer the matter to someone who is well-informed who can maybe enlighten you.
Okay, so you seek help.
You seek help within the community, yes. But if you still can't find anyone to solve the difficulty, if the problem remains, you must still retain your regard for these traditions and your faith in them.
So the belief has to endure. Even if no one can give you a logical explanation, that is a powerful command.
It's the ultimate test. If it remains unsolved, you adopt the next best course, whatever partial understanding you can manage, and then you just have to trust the Imam for the rest. Faith becomes the bridge where your intellect fails.
But there is one practical safeguard here which I found interesting. It acknowledges the messiness of human communication.
Right. It requires followers to use discretion when receiving information from the Imams through, say, news or third-party reports.
Not directly from the source.
Exactly. It's a very practical instruction. It says, look, while the words of the Imam are perfect, the transmission of those words through other people might be flawed. So you have to apply discernment to the delivery method while preserving your absolute belief in the perfection of the source itself.
It's a way to filter out gossip without questioning the authority.
Precisely.
So this deep dive, it's really revealed this incredibly demanding spiritual life. It's built on two pillars that almost seem contradictory. On one hand, you have this absolute mandated reverence, total obedience, bowing down, fearing the Imam more than a king.
And on the other hand, you have an equally absolute requirement for deep intellectual engagement. Thoughtful looking, intense pondering, treating their speech with the highest mental rigor. It's a stunning marriage of absolute faith and mandatory intellectual pursuit.
Which presents a profound challenge, doesn't it? How does a follower balance that intellectual duty to constantly ponder and question their own understanding with the ultimate spiritual duty to just surrender that questioning and trust when understanding fails?
The mental discipline required to hold both of those truths at the same time is just immense. And that right there is the code of conduct. It completely redefines the relationship.
Yeah, it does.
And by establishing that the words of the Imams are practically the words of the Prophet, and that one thoughtful verse is better than a whole text read thoughtlessly, this code teaches a kind of intellectual humility.
And that leads us to our final thought for you to ponder. Given this code of conduct, which mandates this constant vigilance and assumes the flaw always lies with the reader, how might our own approach to any authoritative text, spiritual, philosophical, even scientific change if we were to adopt the mentality that any failure to understand lies with our own current capacity and not with the source material itself?